Spring practice is almost here, but Hugh Freeze would rather have OTAs. Welcome on into the Auburn Express, powered by the War Report. I'm your host, Mike G, and thank you so much for giving us a listen today. Joining me, as he does every week, is my good friend Chris Phillips from SEC Unfiltered. We're going to filter the topics today, Chris. No unfiltered topics today. We're talking spring practice. It's upon us, right? February's feel different. They hit different now that signing day is no longer really a thing in February. 95% of classes now are signed in December with early signing day. It's become a complete non-event. Feels like the offseason, Chris, is stretching out longer here. They're giving us less stuff to engage with from January to August. But the topic has come up recently, and coaches are weighing in on the usefulness of spring ball and spring games. So I want to read a quote here from Hugh Freeze. Now this is a quote from the Senior Bowl, and he was joking but somewhat serious because he's logged his opinion on this in the past. He said that he wished that they didn't have spring ball. He'd prefer to have OTAs in June, similar to the NFL. He says, I wish they could just be with the strength coach and work and get their bodies in the best shape of their lives, and us do individuals and walkthroughs. No spring ball and OTAs. Good for college football, good for the SEC, or, how do you feel about this here? There's been a lot of debate about this over the years.
That's how I feel about it, Mike. It's, and appreciate you having me on as always. Always a pleasure. And I think this is a fascinating topic. I'm glad we're discussing it because obviously Hugh Freeze's comments, we saw obviously Texas isn't having a spring game. Mizzou came out. They're not having one. I know that Auburn will, Vandy will, others out there will. It's just another thing where we're tinkering with college football. And, Mike, I mean, let's just call it what it is. It makes college football less likable. It's another thing, in my opinion, that makes the sport less likable. And I don't know why we've become sort of obsessed with, like, the tinkering of the sport. Like, it's like we're almost just starting to change stuff to do it. And it's making college football less and less and less recognizable. Now, I understand not having a spring game from the standpoint of, hey, you don't want to put some of your best guys out there on tape. You don't want, with the portal and NIL and the tampering, like especially if you've got a guy, Mike, is a diamond in the rough on your roster, and you don't maybe want to put him on full display where all of your rivals and opponents can scout him and then they get, busy on the tampering, like I mentioned. So, but I hear what Hugh Freeze is saying. I'm not saying he's totally wrong that OTAs, and Sarkisian mentioned this too, that, OTAs could be a useful way to go through spring. But, I'm someone, Mike, I've got memories as a kid of going to a spring game. And for some people, that's like the only game they can make, with especially how expensive it is. And, the local economies of these college towns, they depend on spring games, 40, 50, 60 plus thousand coming to watch the team. It's like I understand it from the coach's perspective, but I hate it as a college football fan because, again, the sport continues to become less recognizable. And to the point, Mike, where, yes, we truly do have an offseason now. I think we need to recognize and embrace that. College football is having an offseason, and this has been the most fascinating offseason, Mike, for me from a content perspective and kind of gauging people's interest, if you will, or lack thereof. Like, I think there's real football fatigue out there amongst common fans. And I think stuff like this is what contributes to it, man. It's kind of like the common fan doesn't have time to keep up with the changes and the the sport just evolving. And it's like, hey, you know what? I'll get back to you in August. We're about to kick this thing off. And I don't know, to your point, how healthy that is for the sport.
Yeah. I mean, look, Sarkisian was pointing to health and the rash of injuries that they've experienced and saying, hey, let's get rid of this. Should this be looked at as from an angle of what's best for the student athlete, right? Like,
and that's very fair, Mike, not to cut you off, because there's more games. I mean, Sarkisian mentioned that as well. I know Hugh Freeze has. Like, I mean, if you're going to ask these guys, if you're making a run at the national title, to play 17 games, well, then I understand, like, limiting their work. But, yeah, I guess it's a domino effect. I mean, because to your point, we want more of a playoff, and you could be on, a different side of this. You want an expanded playoff. you got to take something else away. And
Yeah.
it seems like spring ball is going to be that thing.
Well, now only 12 teams have to worry about those extra games, obviously, and then beyond that, only.
But you want to think your team's going to be one of the 12, right? I
Yeah.
mean,
Okay. Fair.
You want to prepare that way, like we're going to be in that playoff.
Yeah, it's a lot. It's a lot. If you're a college athlete, you have a truncated timetable to prepare your body for the season. So if you're going to get stronger, if you're going to get faster, if you're going to put on mass, if you're going to put on muscle and drop fat, you got to do that in the off season. And that's where the bulk of their time has to be spent. So normally from January, if you're not in a bowl, if your bowl, once your bowl game's done, to the start of spring practice, it's weight room, Chris. It's running, it's conditioning, it's all those things. And then you get into spring ball, and after spring ball, you get into summer workouts. And then you got another maybe 2.5 months, 3 months max to get your body in playing shape for the season. Because once the season starts, you are what you are. And the coaches seem to be saying, look, we'd rather spend more time on conditioning. Now, like I know, the number one reason you train is to prevent injury. That's why athletes train. They train to prevent injury. If you are poorly trained, you could be very naturally fast. But you get out there, if you don't train right, you're more likely to pull a hamstring or hurt your knee or do something that's going to get you hurt, especially in a game as physical as football. But I do think that it would be better for the health of the sport that the coaches have more control over the process, right? And we're not doing things just for the sake of doing them because, hey, this is the way we've always done it. So I agree with Freeze. I think that OTAs would be kind of cool to watch, right? Rather than meaningless practices where they only let you see certain drills because they don't want to give anything away.
Yeah, I mean, the hype for spring ball, Mike, let's call it for what it is. I mean, I feel like I'm telling people that Santa Claus isn't real, which if you got youngsters out there, cover your ears. But the hype is always outweighed what we actually get out of spring practice. I just think it's always, Mike, exciting to, that first day of spring ball, whether it comes in late February, early March, whenever it might come, or for Auburn this year, late March, like those first videos of the guys back in pads and back on the field, like it just – it is exciting, right? And I think we all know, too, like you made the point, Mike. I mean, spring games, again, the hype and the hoopla is always outweighed what you actually get. It is a glorified scrimmage. I mean, truly it is. But I don't know. It just feels like one of those things, man. To your point, like change is always met with resistance. I totally understand that, but I simply ask the question. And we got to think about the student athletes, absolutely, the teams themselves. But does it make the game more likable or less likable for the common fan? And I've noticed a shift, Mike, amongst common fans where it's, again, I think it's one of the reasons people really are leaning into college basketball this time of year, college baseball getting going, because it's just college football it's changing so much so rapidly. I think it's hard. Up, and then you tell them the sport it's becoming NFL light, essentially. If it's not already there yet.
Pause for a second. Your internet cut out for like 5 seconds.
Okay,
right?
I'll go back to
you were saying college football is changing so rapidly, it's hard, and then it cut there.
Yeah. So college football is changing so rapidly, Mike. I just think with the rule changes, with NIL, portal, now you're talking about spring games. It's just hard for the common fan to keep up, which, again, I think is one of the reasons we're seeing fans lean into some of these other sports, college basketball, college baseball, even maybe more so than they have in years past. So, again, good for the student athletes. I think it could be good for the teams, and you don't just stay the same because you've always been that way, like you mentioned, but it just, I think the common fans are wondering, like, when is the tinkering going to stop? Because that's when I think people will really dive back into it. Even if spring ball is meaningless, even if spring games are glorified scrimmages, it's like, they were our meaningless practices. They were our meaningless glorified scrimmages. And I mean, I think people really enjoyed, like, and still do enjoy, like, getting out to the ballpark, getting out to the stadium for a spring game and taking the kids out there. Like, a lot of people have these core memories of what spring games were. And just, again, to think that those could vanish, I'll tell you, though, and I know you're going to hate me for doing this, The guy I give credit to is Lane Kiffin. I think he was ahead of it last year.
Okay.
Like, Ole Miss didn't have – they had like a spring event, but it wasn't a game, right? They had a dunk contest. They had a wing eating contest. They had a whatever. And, like, people kind of looked at it as like, man, that's really silly. But, Mike, that's probably what spring games are going to turn into. They're going to turn more to, like, fan appreciation days than guys are putting pads on and hitting each other. So, I don't know. It is fascinating to watch the evolution of the sport.
It is. It is fascinating. So right now, and correct me if I'm wrong, most springs consist of 15 practices and a 8A game or a spring game, or 15 practices with the 8A game included in the 15 practices. It's a way to get a look at your team in some live situations, but the coaches are saying we want to reduce the risk of injury and attrition that happens in spring. And the 8A game itself is something that doesn't yield a lot of results for them. Now, I have an argument to make for keeping the 8A game that we'll talk about right after a quick word from our friends at the Rogue Shop. Visit rogueshop.com, use code reporter, get 15% off that Rogue Shop order. Guys, the college basketball Tournament of Champions is around the corner. It's getting ready to happen. So if you are betting on the NCAA tournament and you want to keep your cool, the Rogue Shop has you covered. Use code REPORT for 15% off. Also, this segment is brought to you by our friends at Golden's Cast Iron. Visit goldenscastiron.com/WR to get 15% off your weights with code Get Your Weight Up and $65 off fire pits and Kamado grills with code TWR. My dad has the Kamado grill, Chris. It is a fantastic lifetime product, making lots of memories with my pop around the grill this spring, courtesy of Golden's Cast Iron, great sponsors of the War Report. Let's jump back in here. Look, I think that A-Day is a great opportunity to simulate a game day environment and see how your players react in that environment, particularly your freshmen coming in. If you're Auburn, Deuce Knight and Jackson Arnold are pretty much the only quarterbacks you have to worry about this spring. I think there's value in putting Deuce in front of a crowd of 30,000 and seeing how he does under that sort of pressure. That'll be the biggest crowd he's played in front of in his life. So
I would agree, Mike. I mean, listen, if you can't do it in a spring game atmosphere, how in the world are you going to do it when there's 100,000 screaming at you? Pick your SEC venue, right? So I mean, I for those that maybe say, oh, it's just a meaningless whatever. It's not meaningless to the kids strapping it on and playing. I mean, and you've seen like some other schools out there really take advantage of what a spring game can provide, making the spring game at night, putting guys under the lights in your venue. I mean, heck, again, people want to say they're meaningless. We've seen Bama, Georgia, Texas, others have 90,000 plus to come watch a spring game. So, I mean, be careful what you wish for. That's all I'm saying. I mean, you lose an opportunity to. I mean, it's not a full-on simulation of what a game day in the fall is going to be, but it's about close as you're going to get without playing an actual game. Because again, we don't get a preseason. Which, to your point, Mike, I do wonder if at some point, our coach is going to say, "Hey, we don't need a spring game, but what we do need is a preseason exhibition." Like, are we going to get to that point where college football is going to copy the NFL and have a 2 or 3 game preseason? Would that work? Would people watch? Which I think the answer is yes. I just the changes aren't done yet, man. We're just kind of getting started when it comes to changes. They ain't done yet.
Multiple former and current Auburn coaches have suggested if we're going to play that game, play it against a Division II school in state or an HBCU and donate the proceeds to charity, which I've got a huge charitable bone, and I love the idea of doing something like this and, helping underprivileged or impoverished communities in the state of Alabama, giving to a cause, helping people with cancer. Bruce Pearl has his Outlive Foundation that helps people with the costs associated, with being diagnosed with cancer and having to be laid off work, groceries, travel expenses, right? Like, if you could look at doing something in the community service realm, but charitable and involving the community in that, I think that would be a good route to go if we're going to keep these games.
Yeah. I mean, Mike, how long before we're seeing schools charge admission for a spring game and all of it's going to NIL? I mean,
Yeah,
how
yeah,
long before that happens? Where it's more of an NIL event than anything. So, I mean,
yeah.
I'm surprised that's not already a
You're
thing. 'Cause
you're 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 onto something here
they're
too.
going to get creative. There's no question they're going to get creative.
Well, we know in a couple months, Chris, that the schools are going to be taking over
Mhm.
the NIL, the whole more directly.
Yeah.
So collectives are about to either be absolved into the university or abolished completely, and we can
Mhm.
stop pretending like coaches aren't having input in how this money is getting spent through
Right.
the collective. Uh,
Yeah.
I'll tell you, I'm all about athletes getting paid, but I don't think everything needs to be about NIL. I
Yeah.
think this is one thing we can keep separate from NIL and saying, hey, like, let's do some good for our community with these
Mhm.
spring games,
Yeah,
man.
I love it. I love the idea. I mean, I do. I love that idea. So I would be all for like because every other sport has like a preseason exhibition of some kind. I mean,
Mhm.
baseball in the fall will scrimmage or inter squad against other teams. Obviously, basketball literally plays an exhibition before they get going. I definitely think football. But then again, then you're asking coaches and all them like, hey, we're going to add another legitimate game onto already your 12 plus a conference title plus a playoff. Like, so do you want to add another game, even if it is an exhibition?
Yeah, yeah. You obviously have to put rules around it to protect the student athlete's health.
Yeah.
I'm not saying that you need to make it flag football essentially, but fans do want to get, I think, an idea of the sort of athleticism that a guy like Deuce Knight brings to the
Mhm.
football team. See him throw a deep ball, see him, and maybe there are different ways to do that than just having a full on scrimmage. But
Mhm.
I don't think the answer is eliminating spring activities and excluding the public from that completely. Football has the longest offseason of any sport, Chris. And I
Mhm.
think for the health of the game, it is a good idea to keep fans engaged regularly from
Mhm.
January to the start of fall camp in August.
Yeah.
And
Yeah, I'd
that's an
agree.
opportunity you have to do that.
Yeah, I'd agree. And again, I just go back to Mike, and I did a segment on this a few weeks ago that just from my perspective and what I've noticed, maybe it's just a me thing, but I feel like the common fan has never been more disconnected this time of year from college football than they are currently. And it's again, that's just my vantage point, but I think people are really enjoying having an off season and and also too it helps the SEC on the hardwood has been incredible this year. SEC baseball speaks for itself how good it is, but typically I feel like there's a little more juice around football still this time of year. And I don't know. I feel like we really are in an off season for college football. And I just can't help but think because of the nonstop changes, we just got finished with the longest season in college football history. People are kind of catching their breath a little bit. And don't stay the same and complacent for the sake of doing so, but don't change for the sake of doing so either, Mike. And I can't help but think people aren't a little fatigued and exhausted by just the endless amount of changes it feels like to, a sport we all
Yeah.
grew up loving and still love.
Uh, I want to end this conversation talking about the network influence on these decisions. We all know college football is a money machine driven by network deals. The SEC has a massive network deal with ESPN. Obviously, CBS went to the Big Ten very infamously here just recently. Fox has got a big deal. Notre Dame had like an exclusive with NBC. Do you think the networks like the idea of eliminating spring games? Because I'm telling you, they had become full on productions. They were sending, a team down to call the spring game, to comment, full production crews. They're broadcasting them on multiple platforms. It was a good way for them to promote streaming services to say, hey, if you want to watch this year's spring
Yeah.
game at Auburn, you need ESPN Plus. What do the networks you think feel, and are they leaning on Sankey to say, don't let these guys eliminate these spring games?
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure they don't love it. It's, like you
Less
mentioned,
content.
it's one less opportunity to feature the content, yeah, and push their product and push streaming, like you mentioned, because most of these games they are on SEC Network Plus, ESPN Plus. You'll get the occasional, maybe Georgia and Alabama will be on the big channels, or maybe Texas, but Texas again's already announced they're not having one. So I'm sure the networks aren't thrilled about it, Mike. It's one less opportunity for them to promote the streaming services and just promote their services as a whole, right? Because most of these games are on ESPN Plus, SEC Network Plus, what have you. But I wonder kind of what's in the fine print when it comes to contracts, because Steve Sarkisian went ahead and said, nope, no spring game. And I wonder, I'm sure they're not thrilled about it. I wouldn't expect them to be thrilled about it, but can you force them to have spring games for the sake of a television product? I don't know if that's in the contract, if that's in the fine print, if you will, but no, certainly. I mean, I certainly don't think they're excited. I mean, because again, typically you'd have your big ones, Alabama, Georgia, maybe they're on the big channels, but all these others, streaming, are on streaming services. And so the providers of those are not going to be happy. I will say, though, I don't think spring games are going to go away all at once, though, Mike. And I think the reason is because I think you see it across the SEC. Like maybe a Texas, they don't see the value. But I think there's some kind of middle of the pack programs, mid-tier programs. I think they do see the value, Mike, of at every turn. If you can get on TV, or you can be streaming, or you can have a game and put your program on display, what it does for recruiting. I think there's still going to be spring games of people that see the value in it and what it does for your fan base too, if nothing else. So, but yeah, back to ESPN, SEC Network. I don't think they're too thrilled over the idea of just completely getting rid of spring games.
Greg Sankey will have his say, I'm sure, before this conversation is done. As always, great conversation, Chris. I want to thank you for joining me today. SEC Unfiltered. Tell people where they can find you.
Yeah, Mike, always a pleasure, man. I appreciate you having me. We're at SEC Unfiltered. X, Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, also YouTube, podcast, wherever you get those. And, of course, our website, secunfiltered.com. And check me out. I'll be on the road yet again. The SEC Unfiltered Tour rages on. Will take us to Gainesville, Florida this weekend for a little baseball, basketball doubleheader.
That's it for another great edition of the Auburn Express, powered by The War Report with my guy, Chris Phillips. If you want more content like this, please hit like and subscribe. We are The War Report on every social media platform. TW Report on TikTok. We're signing off, and as always, War Eagle.